Hi. We reached the end of Genesis 19 with the horrifying and perhaps comic story of Lot's daughters getting their father drunk on 2 consecutive nights to get themselves pregnant to preserve life. There are so many aspects of the story to look at, not least of which is how the story has been interpreted over the years and from the very patriarchal perspective that, ironically, the story is trying to challenge with the daughter's bold action here. So one of the aspects of this story to look at is not so much the details of Hebrew language. This is not one where translations make all that much difference, or there's a lot of wordplay or ambiguity. What's most important in this story is the characterization and the incredible trauma that these two women have experienced. And I say women, perhaps too boldly, perhaps girls, because as betrothed young women in this context, they may have just reached puberty, and one is older and one is younger. So perhaps one is 12 or 13 and one is 10 or 11, something like that. We can't know exactly, of course, but if we can imagine what these two girls have been through in the last just couple of days, between their father being willing to throw them out to the dogs of the town, their mother being completely silent throughout the whole thing. Why would their mother not stand up for their daughters? Their horrific abandonment by their prospective husbands, the destruction of their hometown and everybody they knew, the death of their mother suddenly, and their father's seeming unwillingness or lack of interest in grieving for the loss of his wife. And now here they are finding themselves in a cave, alone with the same father who was going to throw them to the wolves. It's a horrific situation, and that's what's led many people in our modern time to analyze this through trauma theory, because there's no question about it that these two girls or women, or however you want to characterize them, have been through an unbelievable amount of trauma, having lost their mother, their hometown, all their friends, their prospective husbands, and now finding themselves in this desperate situation. So we really need to pay attention to that as we go. There are also some aspects of the story that show deep connections with the story of Tamar in chapter 38 in Genesis, and also connections, although not quite as tight, with the story of Noah's sons back in Genesis 9. So looking both forward and back, as our Genesis authors so often do, recognizing the only way to really understand any of the chapters in Genesis to understand the whole story. And so if you're just stopping by here, I hope you'll settle in at some point to hear the whole picture of Genesis before you reach any decisions about any given passage. So our particular passage today, as you can see on the keywords element I have on the right side of the screen, is focused on a couple of clear words. The firstborn and younger repeated. They, like their mother, are not named, and that's important to the story. The fact that their father Lot does not know, repeated twice, and the repeated verb to lay down. In contrast with what was taken, as I've shown wrongly, the verb used by the Sodomites to address the men that Lot is taking into shelter in his house as to know, which is never used in a violent or aggressive way, whereas lay with can be and will be in chapter 34, but can be in other ways as well, as it's used in chapter 38 around the question of prostitution. So this is not intimate knowing. This is something transactional that will produce them children, as we'll see. And it's framed in this interesting sort of rhythmic way with this repetition, somewhat like the interaction between Abraham and Yahweh back in 1823 to 33 that we saw on the pattern there, as well as Abraham went down from 50 to 45 to 40 and eventually down to 10. So we see in the first verse there's this parallel line here. Lot, and mentioned he was afraid. It's almost like a poetic parallel. In Zoar settled with his two daughters, but it went from the hills to the cave, and that's the main difference because of his fear, which we'll look at. Then there's this proposal from the firstborn to the younger, and we'll look at that in detail, the execution of that. Then the second half of the proposal, and notice in all of this, only the firstborn is speaking, the younger is not does not speak or have any reaction verbally that we know. And then the second execution, and then a new situation at the end. And so this is the rhythmic pattern of the story, as we'll see. And to help us enter into this, in addition to all the commentaries that I've read historically, I want to share the recent work of 4 authors who have really helped us to bring this story into dialogue with issues and concerns methodologically and psychologically in the modern world. This one from Melissa Jackson, I'm showing these in the order they were written in 2002, on Lot's daughters and Tamar as tricksters in the patriarchal narrative as feminist theology. And she argues here over against previous feminist writers who saw this as a tragedy and almost a victory of patriarchy and forcing these daughters into this horrible situation. She sees it almost the other way around, that the strongest feminist argument is that they're tricksters, and this is meant to be a comedy comedy that's mocking patriarchy. And so we'll look a little at that as we go. Another perspective from a more difficult situation is Catherine Lowe, reconceptualizing kinship for the sake of our daughters. And she uses feminist psychological perspectives based in part on her own experience as the daughter of a sexually abused mother. So she brings in intergenerational trauma into her own reading of the story. Matthew Cortman, who when he wrote this in 2019 was a graduate student and yet did a wonderful job here, Can Anything Good Come from Sodom? A feminist and narrative critique of Lot's daughters. And writing as a man giving a feminist critique, he shows very carefully that there may be a strategy from the older daughter to trick her younger sister into having sex with their father. So we'll look more at that as we go too. And then finally, this from Kirsty Cobb, who reads it not only just through trauma theory, but also through the fictional trauma in The Handmaid's Tale and comparing women in these difficult situations together. So one of the aspects that comes across in Jackson's, as I noted, this was a comparison of Lot's daughters and Tamar as tricksters. So to highlight some of what she was about, I broke down some of her points with some specific text, so you could see this here. If you're not familiar with the story of Tamar in Genesis 38, I would encourage you to look at it. And I won't summarize the whole story here, but it basically involves a woman whose first two husbands die mysteriously, and that leads her father-in-law to suspect that she is deaf. And so he holds her as a widow, basically a captive, and she decides to break out of that by pretending to be a prostitute to her father-in-law, who and successfully does that, and then reveals herself, and he comes around and honors her for it. He could have killed her for it. So these are some of the parallels between that story and the one we're going to look at here. In both of them, women are challenging father figures over the perpetuation of lineage, and I won't read all the quotes here. I'll post this on the webpage, and you can see it for yourself. There's the absence of a suitable man due to patriarchal customs or choices, including a levirate option, which is the issue in chapter 38 about marrying your brother's, your husband's brother if your husband dies before you're able to have children. And that's not exactly the situation here, but we'll see a certain parallel. The women are both, in quotes, widows experiencing recent trauma. Lot's daughters aren't technically widows because they were never married, but their fiancés are obviously dead in the destruction of Sodom. So they were prepared to be married, and now they're not. And Tamar is expressly a widow, as the text there says, and the father figures are recently widows. Obviously, Lot's wife just turned into a pillar of salt, and Judah's wife died as well. And then there's the question of incest, and I put that in quotes too, because in Leviticus, technically, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to note it, father-daughter sex is not technically incest according to Leviticus, but obviously to anybody reading then or now, it would be inappropriate. And then it's obviously not quite incest with your father-in-law, but close enough. And in both situations, the father figure doesn't know what the women have done expressly. And in our story here in chapter 19, as we saw twice, that he didn't know, although there's something suspicious about that we'll look at. And Judah didn't know as well because she was disguised as a prostitute. Whatever a prostitute looks like, but it worked. And then curiously, both their sons are ancestors of David and thus of Jesus as well. Moab coming from the elder daughter here of Lot, and then and that is in the lineage of Ruth, and then Perez coming from Tamar, and both of those are in Matthew's genealogy. So why would these two stories of women engaging in sexually questionable activity in order to preserve their lineage through a questionable patriarch be narrated as the ancestors of David and Judah? We'll have to look at that a little more, and if you look at Matthew's gospel, which is not currently one of my series, but maybe by the time you're watching this at some future point it is. So with all those things in mind, let's look at the shape, keep the shape of it up, and then go back and look more closely at the details of our story. And one of the key things is right at the beginning, and Cortman makes a point of this over against scholars who want to say that that what the firstborn says to the younger here, our father is old and there's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the world, may be wrong, but it's a naive misunderstanding of the scope of the destruction if they perceive that in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah the whole world was destroyed. But as Cortman and others note, but he makes a highlight of this, they were already in Zoar. So they know that Zoar exists. And of course, one of the great ironies is Lot insisted on going to Zoar after the angel said he should go in the hills. But after they go to Zoar, he leaves Zoar and goes up into the hills with the daughters, for he's afraid to stay in Zoar. So they end up in a cave. So ironically, he got what he wanted over against a divine command and doesn't go for it at all, which is highlighting what we've seen from Lot since the very beginning back in chapter 13. He makes choices based on his immediate sense of things. He's not in relationship with God at all, and that leaves his daughters in a very bad situation. So it's also bad here because 3 times in this verse, the word for settle, we noticed it before, you should, which can also mean just simply sitting, but it's 3 times here in the New RSV covers up the repetition, which if we hear it, then you can really hear the emphasis, and I've translated it that way here. So he went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills. He was afraid to settle in Zoar, so he settled in a cave. And settling in a cave is really a miserable situation because how long has it been since anybody in the Israel line were cave people? We can't even know if they ever were. And of course, there are caves in this area, just like the caves that found the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, um, but not ones that people live in. And so we get to the beginning of this immediate scene here. And my notes below are based on older scholars that suggest that they really did believe that there were no men left, but not necessarily so. And so what's going on here? If the firstborn knew, and having been in Zoar, that there were men there, what's going on in her telling her younger sister, there's not a man on earth to come into us? 2 ways to read that based on the scholarship I was just pointing out to you. Cortman sees this as a strategy on her part, that she's deliberately misleading her younger sister, based on the idea the younger sister may not be old enough to really understand what's going on, although we don't know how much age difference there is between them. And if they're just 12 and 10, there's probably not a lot of extra sophistication in the slightly older one, but we just don't know that detail. But on that theory, the idea is that she's trying to convince her younger sister of this so that she can end up having her father pregnant with her daughter to protect her from the person who's the most threat to her, which is her father. Which is to say that if they had sex with somebody else or married somebody else, their father, who was willing to throw them to the wolves, would still be roving around. But if they impregnate themselves with his child, perhaps he would be moved to at least care for them and care for the child enough to preserve his own lineage, since he apparently has no sons. That's a dark speculative view of it, but it's a dark story. Another perspective we see from both Lowe and from Kersey in the analysis of trauma is the question of the experience of trauma lead to traumatic amnesia, and the scrambling of chronology that makes it difficult for women or anybody who's a victim of trauma to compose a chronological narrative of their events. And it often takes, as we know, many years of therapy to unpack the emotions from the physical experience, to organize it in your mind to really understand what's happening. And this is in the immediate aftermath. We don't know how long it's been that they stayed in Zoar before they went to the cave, but it can't be very long. And so they're still certainly subject to this trauma that may have just scrambled their memory. And so maybe they just went through Zoar in a daze and don't really know what's going on there. And that this is sincere from the elder, if not exactly true. Either of those could be possible. So notice also the fact that they're not named. There's no reason the narrator can't name them, but this is perhaps the perspective from Lot and from these city people that, unlike Abraham and Sarah, Sarah being named, of course, and even Hagar's name, that this is the line that's going to go dead here, except it's not quite going to go dead because it's going to lead to David and Jesus, as we saw through this sort of back door. But at least the lineage that has Lot and city people as part of this will die here. So the first one says to the younger, our father is old, and we don't know how old he is. Curiously, we know how old Abraham and Sarah are to the year, but we don't know how old Lot is. He's a generation younger than Abraham and Sarah, but that wouldn't make him exactly a child, would it? So they're not a man on earth here, or Ba'eretz, as in the world, to come into us after the manner of all the world. And the use of the term come into us is what leads some to hear this as potentially the Levirate situation, that's a phrase used even in Deuteronomy 25 and one of the passages around that. So that's one consideration there, that they're considering using their father as a substitute for their husbands to preserve life. So there's the situation, and she proposes, "Come," and the English matches the Tower of Babel story, but it's not the same in the Hebrew. So it matches the call of Abram in chapter 12, but not the Tower of Babel. So it's a little misleading if we hear this, the "Come let us" is echoing the Tower of Babel. It does not in the Hebrew. "Come let us make our father," and notice the other speaks of "my father" in verse 34, "drink wine." Um, and the word here, the word is have someone drink. And so wine is a separate word. Make drink is the word here, highlighting the element of force. They're forcing him to do that, and we will lie with him, and so that we may preserve offspring through our father. And it's another curious thing that the writers considering trauma theory address here is why the older would want to specifically preserve her horrible father's offspring. If she wants to preserve life, why does she want to preserve this man's lineage rather than some other man's lineage? You'd think she might want to be as free from him as possible, but she's in a traumatized state, so she's plainly not thinking clearly. Or maybe she thinks that's the best way to save her life, is, as I mentioned, in Cortman's view, to have her impregnated with her father's seed. So they carry it out here, and then there's a curious element of this story, and I've tried this out with undergraduate males in my classes and asked them about the versamillitude of this scene. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Really? Is that really possible? Now, from the first point, you start from sobriety and you have to get drunk. So, as we can see, I'll show you in a moment from a few 17th century images. Apparently, this scene was very popular in 17th century art and not much before or after. An art historian would have to answer that. I can't address that. But the issue is, if he's drunk enough not to know what's happening, would he be able to do the deed? To put it bluntly, could he maintain an erection if he's so drunk he doesn't even know that the daughters he's drinking wine with ended up having sex with him? And it happens 2 nights in a row. So let's look at a couple of these pictures. And these pictures are almost embarrassing, I have to say myself. So you might want to close your eyes, but they're classic Renaissance art. So there's that. This one from Joachim Well, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, from 1600. And when I picked up this one, I thought, I can hardly even look at it, not just because it's naked, but because of the obvious debauchery of the situation. And this does not look like a lot who doesn't know what's happening, does it? It looks like the two daughters and their father are having quite the party. Perhaps even more so, not quite in this one from Rubens, 1610, looking at them in chronological order, where they're plainly having fun pouring the wine and all drinking together. And that's an element of this that the text doesn't say. It says make their father drink wine. It doesn't say they drank with him. And if they're only 10 or 12 years old, what's going on with that as well? But then our final one from Simon Vouet, I suppose, Vouet, from 1633, with his hand on his daughter's breast, and that's about all I can take of that, and maybe you too. So in all of these, the reason I show those is not to show the odd popularity of this scene for artists in the 17th century, but how they all portray Lot as fully in on this situation. There may be a point where he passes out and they have sex with their drunken asleep father, but if he's fallen asleep, he plainly can't maintain enough of an erection to impregnate a daughter. So there's something the narrator's not telling us here. Is it for protecting Lot's reputation? How much of Lot's reputation is there to protect? It's hard to see that there's any left. So it's hard to know what's going on there. And then it simply repeats. Although the repetition is slightly different, leaving out as it always does, behold, I lay last night with my father, let us make him drink wine tonight, that you may go in and lie with him. Although the art showed them both getting drunk with him, apparently only one went in at a time. Obviously, he could only have sex with one of them at a time to make them pregnant. But you'd think the second night he might understand what was going on, but apparently not. And so it concludes that they both become pregnant, and we don't know how long has gone by before they become pregnant. We never hear any response from the father. We don't hear any concern of, how did you get pregnant, my daughters? How long are they in the cave? Did they raise these children in the cave? We don't hear anything about any of that. Instead, the writer gives us something about the direction it's going. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab, which is only mentioned one other time in Genesis, the answer of the Moabites to this day. And the younger also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami, which is a little bit of a code, means son of my relative, which is not quite naming the incest, but almost, ancestor of the Ammonites today, which is a little wordplay in Hebrew, because Ammon is a Hebrew word, but naming a group of people or a person, but Ami is a play on for family and relative. So the older bore Moab, and that sets up this parallel where Moab points us to Ruth, and Ruth points us to David, and David points us to Jesus. And it's the same in both stories, as we saw here in the Tamar situation as well. So if we read both these stories together, as certainly the author of Genesis intends us to do, perhaps we see Lot's daughters not as debauched or doing anything terrible, but as bold and courageous women who are daring to take on their violent patriarchal father with the only weapon they have, the fertility that is meant to bring life to all people, but perhaps all it succeeds to do is saving their life, and ironically producing a lineage that will save other people's lives in the distant future. We'll continue with chapter 20 next time. See you then. Bye-bye.